Hello, Lovelace, and welcome to today's history lesson. As you can see from our question for today, it's can I use different sources of information to find out how Anglo-Saxon Britain was ruled? So today we're going to look at how the country was split up between the different tribes and how laws and rules were enforced. Okay. Very quick recap. We all know now that from our previous lessons, tribes from Northern Europe crossed the North Sea and they invaded the south coast of England and the east coast of England. And you can see from our coloured arrows, it was the Angles who headed from southern Denmark to northern England, Northumbria, and central England, Mercia. You can see from the red arrow that the Saxons left Germany and the Netherlands and invaded East Anglia. And the Jutes, the yellow arrow, they left northern Denmark and headed south down the North Sea and came ashore on the south coast in Kent. Okay, but once they'd invaded, once they'd landed, then they needed to set up their settlements. And I've seen some wonderful, wonderful speeches from our last lesson describing the sorts of settlements that are needed and the sorts of lands that need to be found and all the provisions and resources from water to wood to flat land for farming and so on. Some wonderful speeches. So well done, guys. So these invading Anglo-Saxons gradually spread out, finding perfect land to build their settlements. So initially, the tribes would have fought for land against the Britons, but they were superior warriors. The Anglo-Saxons were much more experienced and better fighters than the Britons. And soon, any Briton who wouldn't live alongside the Anglo-Saxons headed west to Wales and to Cornwall. Joining the native Welsh and Cornish peoples, they became better known as the Celts. Okay, so the Britons who headed west and joined the Welsh and the Cornish people became known as the Celts. But here's a map of how England and Wales were split up as the various Anglo-Saxon tribes took over. Okay, so the dark green areas, they show where the Celts settled, and you can see this area down here. This is Cornwall. Here's Wales, and then this side here is what is now Lancashire and Cumbria. But in those days, there's the Pennines, a line of mountains here, which provided a really good defense to allow the Celts to settle here and make it very difficult for the Anglo-Saxons to cross this mountain range and get to them. So they had a natural protection there of the Pennines, okay, a line of hills and mountains. So that's why the Celts were able to settle here. They stayed in Wales and in Cornwall. But the pale green areas, that shows where the Anglo-Saxon tribes claimed their lands. And just finally, a quick mention, the pale brown here, that's Scotland, and this is where the Picts tribes settled. Now, they would quite often head south and try to invade, but the Anglo-Saxon tribes and armies of Northumbria regularly just fought them back. Okay, so that's how the country was split up. Over time, and this took about 200 years, the various Anglo-Saxon groups settled in different parts of the country, and they formed several kingdoms, often changing and constantly at war with each other. By 650 AD, there were 7 separate kingdoms as shown. Now, we need to remember, guys, that these were 3 different tribes, the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, who didn't get along. We know there was lots of wars and fighting in Northern Europe. That's one of the reasons they left. So just because they've moved does not mean all of a sudden they like each other. So there were still lots of internal fightings between the tribes, lots of wars between the various sections and the various areas. Okay, so this wasn't a time of peace, but as you can see, after a couple of 100 years, things just started to calm down a little, and 7 clear kingdoms were created. And we're going to look briefly at each one. So first of all, Northumbria. This is where the monk Bede, and we'll talk more about religion and the monks in our next lesson. But this is where the monk Bede from 600, about, that little C means circa, so it means about. So about 670 to 735. He lived and wrote his ecclesiastical history of Britain. Okay, so we get a lot of information from archaeology, but there are still some books and scripts that have survived from that period of time, some writings. And Bede's writings are one of them, I'll say, certainly one source of information about this period in our history. So Northumbria is the green area here. Next, we get to Mercia. Their best known ruler was a man called Offa, and he built Offa's Dyke along the border between Wales and England. And this large kingdom stretched over the Midlands. Now, Offa's Dyke is this black line here, and what it was a really long mound of earth. Basically, he created a natural wall between his kingdom of Mercia and the Celts in Wales. And it just made protecting his border that little bit easier. Many sections of Offa's Dyke are still visible if you visit the border between England and Wales. And it's just a rounded piece of earth, just like a man-made hill or a man-made earth wall. Okay, so that creates a border there between Mercia, the Purple Kingdom, and Wales. Kent, this was settled by the Jutes, if you remember. Well, Ethelbert of Kent was the first Anglo-Saxon king to be converted to Christianity by St. Augustine in around 595 AD. Now, again, we're going to come back to the religion side of things, but we will certainly be mentioning this man, St. Augustine. So, but Kent was ruled at the time by Ethelbert. And he became one of the first kings, the first Anglo-Saxons to be converted to Christianity. And Kent, you can see down here, the light blue area. Okay. And as I've said, we will discuss more on the religion of the Anglo-Saxons in our next lesson. East Anglia. Now, for these next few, you'll start to see where the names came from. So East Anglia, now made up of Angles, because although the Saxons landed in East Anglia, they gradually migrated south. So much of East Anglia, this yellow area, has now been taken over by the Angles, who drifted south. Okay, so they've taken over this area now. 200 years after the landings, they've now taken over East Anglia. The North folk, living in modern Norfolk, and the South folk living in Suffolk. Okay, so you can see where the names come from. So Norfolk and Suffolk coming from North folk and South folk. And East Anglia is where the Sutton Hoo ship burial was found. Now, the Sutton Hoo site is a very, very, very famous archaeological site. An Anglo-Saxon burial ship was unearthed, was dug up, full of artifacts. And it's helped us learn a lot about our Anglo-Saxon predecessors. So if you're curious about Sutton Hoo, then if you Google Sutton Hoo, you will see a beautiful, beautiful death mask and lots of other artifacts that were dug up at the time. So a really, really interesting piece of our history. Okay? And Sutton Hoo is found in East Anglia. Essex, and Essex comes from East Saxons, or East Sax. Here, the famous Battle of Maldon was fought against the Vikings in 991. Now, again, in the next few, say in a week or so, we'll start to look at how the Vikings crossed and took over from the Anglo-Saxons. Okay, so the Anglo-Saxons weren't the only invaders of Britain. The Vikings had a go as well, and we'll look at that in lessons to come. In Sussex, or South Saxons, so South Sax becomes Sussex, they settled here. And then Wessex, where the West Saxons, the West Sax becomes Wessex. Later, the kingdom of King Alfred, who was the only English king ever to have been called the Great. Some of you may have heard of Alfred the Great. If you haven't, you will do soon. So there's Wessex. So there are 7 kingdoms. Now, your first task is to do a little bit of language research. There's 2 words there, 2 Old English Anglo-Saxon words, and I would like you to look them up and tell me what they mean. The first one is sinning, and the second one, Bretwalda. Okay. Now, these 2 words relate to kingdoms, but I'm not going to say any more than that. So that's task 1. I would like you to look up those 2 words, okay, and tell me what they mean. I'm going to show you that again at the end, so don't panic. We've got 2 short tasks today, and I'll put them both up together at the end of the lesson. Right. So law and punishment. Today, if you break the law, it'll usually be the police who deal with you. You might be arrested, and then you're sent to court, where a judge, and sometimes a jury, if it's a serious crime, might decide to give you a fine or send you to prison. That's how things work today. Okay. Children are treated a little differently. Around here, you have to be 18 to be treated as an adult. And the punishments for children are not as severe. Okay, but you are punished. So don't think you won't get punished if you commit a crime. It's just the punishments themselves are not always as serious as if you were an adult. Okay? So you have to be 18 to be treated as an adult. But going back to Anglo-Saxon times, there was no police service, but there were still laws. People still had to behave in a particular way. It was still a society, and people followed basic rules so that everyone could get along and get on together. So people were expected to behave in certain ways and follow the rules. And if they didn't, the punishments could be quite serious. But here's one for you. Because in Anglo-Saxon times, as soon as you reached 10 years old, you were considered an adult and you could be punished in exactly the same way. And I think when you hear about what some of the punishments can be, say, you'll be regretting committing your crime. So as year 5, I know some of you are getting very close to 10 years old, you would be considered an adult in Anglo-Saxon times. So, task 2. If there were no police, how did the Anglo-Saxons keep their laws? Can you find out? I'd like to know, and it's, say, 2 short paragraphs. What type of laws did they have? So what was thought of as a crime in Anglo-Saxon times? Were their crimes the same as ours? Or did they have completely different crimes? And what punishments did they have for people who broke the rules? There are some weird and wonderful ones, I promise you. Some of them are horrific. Some of them make no sense at all. But it's really interesting to read up about and to find out about. And if you want a few ideas, I've included a link in the lesson description to part of a horrible history program. And it's really good at sharing some of the stranger punishments that are out there. Okay, so do take a look at that, and maybe you'll think twice about committing a crime. So There are two tasks for today. You can pause the video at any point at this time, just so you can take a little note. So the first one, look up those two words. In Anglo-Saxon times, what was a sinning and what was a Bretwalder or Bretwalder? And then task 2, I'd like you to describe to me the sorts of laws that the Anglo-Saxons had and what punishments there were for people who broke those rules and broke those laws. Okay, that's the end of the lesson. Thank you very much for your attention. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you very soon.